Today's lesson is on changes of state. In order to achieve the learning objectives for this, we need to first of all understand what solids, liquids and gases are. Then we need to describe how solids, liquids and gases can change state using some key words. We've already looked at in the diffusion lesson, particle scientists look at how particles behave and study their properties. They earn approximately between £17,000 to £1,000. So what do we mean by changes of state? Now, as you can see, there's three diagrams on this slide. There's an ice cube, some water and some steam. How do we define these? So first of all, we know that there's three states of matter, which are solids, liquids and gases, and what we need to know is how they are arranged in terms of their molecules and their particles. So first of all, with solids, the particles or the arrangement of the molecules are very regular. They're very close together, as you can see from the diagram below. Because they're arranged in a nice pattern, tightly packed together, they have very little space for movement, and the very little movement that they do have is in the form of vibrations. You then have liquids, which are random or irregular but close together. The molecules therefore can move around each other because they have small gaps, as you can see from the diagram below. A good example of this is water. And lastly, you have gases. Now, as you can see from the diagram below, there's lots of gaps in between. Because they have lots of gaps in between, they are random and wide apart. Therefore, the movement is very quick and random in direction. So, as you can see, all three diagrams differ, and this is why they have different properties. So, why can you not compress a brick, and why can you easily compress a balloon? I want you to take these three diagrams into consideration and pause the video for a moment and think about why is it that we can squash a balloon but we can't actually compress or squash a brick. Okay, so what we should have realized is from the solids, we know that the brick is a solid, and because there's no gaps in between, there's very little movement, so you can't squash or compress the brick. The particles or the molecules are closely together, therefore allowing no space for movement. On the other hand, you've got a balloon. In a balloon, we obviously put in gas. If you look at the diagram for the gas, the particles are far apart, which allows them to move into different directions, and therefore it is easily squashed or compressed. So changes in state, when a substance changes from one state to another, we call it a change in state. Now, there are four processes that you need to know. These are melting, evaporating, condensing and freezing. So what is melting? Melting is when it turns from a solid to a liquid. A very good example of this is chocolate. Chocolate is a solid. As you heat it, it turns into a liquid. The next example is evaporating. This is when it turns from a liquid to a gas. A good example is when you boil water for a cup of tea, for example. So if you continuously boil it, it turns from the water into steam, and this is going from a liquid to a gas. The next one is condensing, or otherwise known as condensation. This is when it turns from a gas to a liquid. An example is when the gas hits the cold surface of the window and it turns back into liquid, which is water. And lastly, we have freezing. Some of you may do this at home. It's when you turn a liquid into a solid. A good example is putting water into ice cube trays and making ice cubes, which obviously are a solid. So how do the different changes of state take place? So we've looked at some of these examples already on the previous slide. So melting is the process between the ice cubes melting into water. We looked at the example of the chocolate. So it turns from a solid into a liquid. Now you will need to know this for your test. The next process is when water turns into steam. So you'd have to boil it and it goes through the evaporation process. When gas or steam turns back into liquid or water, we refer to this as condensing or condensation. And lastly, when you turn a liquid into a solid, again, like we looked at previously, we refer to this as freezing. So what is sublimation? Sublimation is the change in state of a substance from a solid to a gas without passing through the liquid state. So it actually skips the middle process. Instead of going through from a solid to a liquid to a gas, it skips the liquid and it goes simply from a solid to a gas.